My father's name was Gerald Harmon, and for most of my life, I thought I knew exactly who he was. A quiet man, stubborn, the kind of man who'd rather fix a broken fence post in the rain than ask a neighbor for help. He died on a Tuesday morning in March, 2 weeks after my son announced he was getting married. And I remember thinking that the timing felt like something out of a bad dream, the kind where you're celebrating and grieving at the same time, and you can't tell which one is louder. I'm 63 years old. I live outside of Knoxville, Tennessee, in a house I've owned for 31 years. I retired early from the railroad, 30 years on the line, mostly track maintenance and later crew supervision. My wife, Carol, passed 8 years ago from ovarian cancer, and since then it's been me, a 12-year-old Labrador named Hatch, and whatever the garden decides to give me that season. My son, Daniel, is 34. He's a good man, careful, like his mother. He works in logistics management for a distribution company about 40 minutes from here, and he's always been the kind of person who thinks before he speaks. I was proud of the man he'd become, and I told him so more often than most fathers bother to. So when Daniel called me in February to tell me he was proposing to a woman named Kristen Aldridge, I said what any father in my position would say. I said I was happy for him, and I was, genuinely. I'd met Kristen twice by that point, once at a birthday dinner for Daniel, and once at a cookout the previous summer, and she seemed fine, polished, confident in a way that filled up every room she walked into. She laughed at the right moments and asked me questions about my work on the railroad with what seemed like real interest. I liked her well enough. I didn't have a single specific reason not to. The problem wasn't Kristen, exactly. The problem started with my father. Gerald Harmon died at 81, and he left behind a house full of things nobody wanted and a financial situation nobody knew existed. I drove up to Morristown to handle the estate. I have a younger sister, Patricia, who lives in Phoenix and couldn't make it in time. And when I sat down with his attorney, a soft-spoken man named Donald Creech, what he told me took me about 15 minutes to fully absorb. My father had sold a piece of land in 1987, 42 acres outside of Morristown that his own father had left him. He'd sold it to a developer for what was, at the time, a reasonable price, and then he'd spent the next 36 years doing almost nothing with the money except moving it quietly between accounts, reinvesting it carefully, living off his railroad pension and Social Security, and never mentioning a single dollar of it to me or Patricia or anyone else as far as I could determine. By the time Donald Creech slid that paper across the desk to me, the number on it was $1.6 million. I sat there in that office on a gray March afternoon, and I thought about every time my father had told me money was tight. Every Christmas, he'd seemed to stretch. Every time I'd offered to help with a repair, and he'd waved me off and done it himself, badly, because he didn't want to spend the money on a contractor. I didn't know whether to cry or laugh or feel something I didn't have a name for yet. I drove home without telling anyone. That part happened naturally, without any deliberate decision. I just didn't pick up the phone. Patricia called that evening and I told her about the house, about the personal items, about the logistics of probate. I did not mention the accounts. I told myself I was waiting until I understood it better. I told myself a lot of things that week. What I understood pretty clearly, even then, was that probate is a public record. Anyone patient enough to look could find it if they knew what they were looking for and where to search. I'd learned that from Donald Creech himself, who mentioned it almost as a footnote while explaining the process. I filed it away and didn't think much about it at the time. I was too busy grieving a man I'd never fully understood and trying to feel something clean about a situation that felt like it had too many layers to untangle all at once. Daniel and Kristen set the wedding date for late September. They'd been together 2.5 years, and the engagement felt right in terms of timing, I suppose. Kristen was 31, worked in commercial real estate, and had a social circle that seemed to operate at a slightly different altitude than the one Daniel and I were used to. Not that there's anything wrong with that. Carol's family had more money than mine when we married, and it never caused a problem between us. People find their way to each other from all kinds of starting points. What I noticed, in those early months of wedding planning, was that Kristen's mother had strong opinions about the budget and no intention of contributing meaningfully to it. The venue she wanted seated 240 people. The catering quote she sent Daniel was the kind of number that made me read it twice. I offered to help cover some of the costs, because I wanted Daniel to have the wedding he deserved without starting his marriage in debt. And I wired money directly to the venue coordinator and to the florist without making a production of it. The first time I noticed something that felt different from ordinary future son-in-law friendliness was in May, at a dinner at Daniel and Kristen's apartment. She'd cooked, which I appreciated. The four of us, me, Daniel, Kristen, and her mother, Sandra, sat around the table, and somewhere in the middle of the meal, Sandra made a comment about the estate sale. She said she'd heard from Kristen that my father had passed recently and asked how things were being settled. I told her it was still in process and changed the subject. That would have been nothing on its own. People ask about those things. What stuck with me was what happened about 3 weeks later, when I met Kristen for coffee, just the two of us, because she'd texted and said she wanted to get to know me better before the wedding. I thought that was a nice gesture. We sat at a place near her office, and somewhere in the second half of the conversation, she asked me whether I'd thought about updating my will now that my father had passed, whether I had an estate attorney, whether I'd considered what my assets would look like for tax purposes now that I was in a different financial position. I remember the exact phrase, in a different financial position. I didn't react. I told her I had things in order and that I'd been meaning to review a few documents. I kept my voice easy and my face neutral, because I'd spent 30 years managing crew conflicts on the railroad and I knew how to hold something inside without showing it. But I drove home that evening with the windows down even though it was cool, because I needed air, and I kept replaying the conversation, trying to figure out exactly how she would know that I was in any different financial position than I'd been 6 months ago. The probate filing was public. That was the only answer that made any sense. She'd looked it up, or someone had looked it up for her. I want to be careful here, because I'm not a man who jumps to conclusions. I have a neighbor who lost a friendship over a misunderstanding that started exactly this way. One person reading too much into a comment, building a case out of coincidence. So I told myself that maybe Kristen was simply a practical person. She worked in real estate. She dealt with financial transactions every day. Maybe this was just how she moved through the world, thinking about these things out loud, and it didn't mean anything beyond that. I kept that thought close for about 6 weeks. Then Daniel called me on a Thursday evening in July, and the first thing he said was that Kristen thought it might be a good idea for me to meet with their financial advisor. Their financial advisor. She'd apparently mentioned to this man, a friend of her mother's named Garrett, who ran a small investment firm in Knoxville, that I'd recently come into a meaningful inheritance and that I was at an age where consolidating assets could be beneficial. Garrett had reached out to Kristen with some materials he wanted me to look over. Daniel was presenting this as a kindness, and I believe he believed it was a kindness, because Daniel trusted his fiancée, and he had no reason at that point to look at this situation the way I was looking at it. I told Daniel that I appreciated the thought and that I had someone I worked with already and I'd reach out if that changed. I kept my voice warm because I wasn't angry at Daniel. I was not angry at Daniel at all. That night, I sat on my back porch for a long time after Hatch fell asleep at my feet, and I thought about my father. I thought about how he'd sold that land in 1987 and never told a soul. I thought about how that used to seem like secrecy or stubbornness, one of his more frustrating qualities, this tendency to hold things close. And sitting there on that porch, I thought about how that same quality was starting to look a lot like wisdom from where I was standing. The wedding was beautiful, genuinely. September in Tennessee. Outdoor ceremony. The hills still green with that late summer green that only lasts about 2 weeks before the colors start. Daniel looked like his mother around the eyes when he smiled, and I had to look away for a moment during the vows because of it. I danced with Kristen's grandmother at the reception because nobody else had asked her, and she told me about her late husband, and we had a genuinely good conversation. I ate too much, and I drove home happy, or something close to it. I told myself that night that I'd been wrong, that I'd been a 63-year-old man sitting alone too many evenings, building suspicion out of things that had innocent explanations. That Kristen loved my son, and this was a new chapter, and I should be grateful for it. I held on to that for almost 6 weeks. In early November, on a Saturday morning, Daniel's car pulled into my driveway. That was normal. He stopped by most weekends when he could. What was not normal was that there was a second car I didn't recognize parked behind him, a silver sedan. Daniel knocked and came in first, and he had a look on his face I hadn't seen since Carol's diagnosis, that careful, controlled look he gets when he's delivering something he doesn't know how to hold himself. He told me Kristen had asked him to bring someone, a notary, a man named Phil who shook my hand and had a soft briefcase with him. Kristen had prepared some documents, Daniel explained. She wanted to propose, setting up what she was calling a family legacy trust, something that would protect my assets, simplify the estate process, streamline things for everyone. The documents were ready to sign if I wanted to look them over. I looked at my son. He was watching me, and I could see he was not fully comfortable, but he'd told himself this was a reasonable thing. He trusted her. He wanted to believe this was coming from the right place. I told Phil I appreciated him coming out on a Saturday. I told Daniel I'd need a few days to have my own attorney review anything before I signed it. I said it the way you say something that sounds completely reasonable and leaves no real opening for argument. Phil left. Daniel stayed for about an hour, and we talked about other things mostly. And when he left, I stood in the kitchen for a long time without doing anything in particular. I called my attorney on Monday morning, a woman named Beverly Marsh, who I'd used for Carol's estate and for some property matters years back. I told her everything from the beginning: the inheritance, the coffee conversation, the financial advisor suggestion, the Saturday morning visit. Beverly listened without interrupting, and when I was done, she asked me two questions. The first was whether I'd signed anything. I had not. The second was whether my son knew the full scope of the inheritance. He did not. Beverly told me, in plain terms, what a family legacy trust of the kind Kristen had proposed could do in the wrong hands. She said she wasn't in the business of assuming bad faith, but she recommended I make no changes to my existing documents and that I keep my financial information private until I had more clarity about what I was dealing with. I already knew that. I'd known it since July. But hearing it from Beverly made it real in a different way. Here's what I want every father and mother listening to understand. Your money is your business. Not your children's business, not your son-in-law's or daughter-in-law's business, not your grandchildren's business until you decide it is. You worked for it. You saved it. You made choices about it across decades. You are not obligated to explain it or share it or open it up for other people's planning, regardless of who those people are to you. That's not selfishness. That's dignity. My father understood that. It took me a long time to see it the same way. By February, 5 months after the wedding, things had deteriorated between Daniel and Kristen in ways I only learned about gradually. Daniel didn't tell me everything at first. He's private, like I said. He came over one evening and he looked tired in the specific way that has nothing to do with sleep, and we sat in the living room with the TV off and he started talking. Kristen had been accessing their shared financial accounts in ways Daniel hadn't known about, moving amounts around. A joint savings account they'd opened together had been reduced by almost $18,000 over 4 months, moved to an account Daniel didn't have access to. When he questioned it, she told him she was investing it and that he was being controlling and paranoid for wanting to know the details. He also found, on a laptop she'd left open, a series of emails between Kristen and her mother Sandra, discussing my estate in terms that were detailed enough that it was clear someone had pulled the probate records and done more than a casual read. There was a specific figure mentioned in one of those emails. It was accurate. Daniel sat in my living room and asked me, quietly, whether I had money from my father that I hadn't mentioned. I told him yes. I told him everything. I told him about the land, about the accounts, about Donald Creech's office in March, about the coffee conversation in May, about the Saturday morning with the notary. I watched his face while I talked. I watched him put it together. He didn't say anything for a long time when I finished. Then he said he was sorry. I told him he had absolutely nothing to be sorry for, and I meant that with everything I had. The marriage was annulled 7 months after the wedding. I won't go into the details because they're Daniel's to share or not share as he chooses. What I'll say is that Beverly helped him understand his options, and that the $18,000 was a separate matter that involved its own process. I stayed out of it as much as I could while making sure Daniel knew I was there. One afternoon in April, about 2 weeks after the annulment was finalized, Daniel drove out and we sat on the back porch. It was one of those spring afternoons in Tennessee that makes you forget every bad thing. Warm, clean air, the yard showing green at the edges, Hatch sleeping on the flagstone. Daniel asked me if he could read the letter my grandfather had left my father, the one that had been found in Gerald's papers and passed to me through the estate. I'd mentioned it to him once and hadn't brought it up again. I went inside and got it from the fireproof box where I keep the documents that matter. I handed it to him and he read it. He read it twice. Then he folded it carefully and handed it back, and he sat quietly for a moment. The letter was 3 paragraphs. My grandfather had written it in 1984, 3 years before my father sold the land. He'd written about the land itself, about how he'd worked it and what it had cost him to maintain it and why he'd never sold it, even when times were hard. And then he'd written something I've thought about nearly every day since I found it. He wrote, Gerald, if you sell it only when you're ready, and put what you get somewhere they can't see. Not because people are bad, because money changes what people think they see when they look at you. Keep what's yours until you know who's looking at you for the right reasons. Daniel looked at the hills at the back of my yard for a while after I read that out loud to him. Then he said, quietly, that his grandfather was a smart man. I told him he was. I told him I wished I'd understood him sooner. I still think about Gerald sometimes, about the years we lost because he was closed off in ways I found frustrating, and I was impatient in ways I'm not proud of. He wasn't a man who explained himself, and I spent a long time resenting that. But I've come to think that some of what I read as stubbornness was actually a kind of protection for himself, and maybe in ways he couldn't have predicted for me. My father never told me about that money. He never told a single person, as far as I can determine, and because he didn't, it came to me clean, without anyone's hands on it, without anyone's plans already laid around it. And because I followed his example, not because I'd planned to, not because I suspected anything right away, but because something in me recognized the right instinct when it appeared Daniel is okay. Daniel still has his savings. Daniel's still healthy and careful and a good man, and we have dinner most Sundays now. Some lessons come to you from the people you admire. Some come to you from the people you misunderstood for most of your life. And sometimes the most important thing someone ever teaches you is something they never said a word about. If you're out there sitting on something similar, if you're a parent with something to protect, and someone in your life who started asking questions that feel slightly off, I want you to hear this. You don't owe anyone an explanation. You don't owe anyone access. What you built is yours. What you inherited is yours. Be careful with it, not because you're suspicious by nature, but because protecting it is exactly what the people who left it to you would want you to do. That's what my father was doing. All those years, in that quiet, stubborn way of his, he was paying attention. I'm still learning how to do the same.